Greetings, everyone. Nathan Nerdarchy here from Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds, and with me I have two nerds.
Nerdarchy's Ted.
Nerdarchy's Dave.
And today we ask, sci-fi RPGs, aren't they just D&D in space?
Hey guys, jump down in the description below where you can sign up for Nerdarchy's newsletter. It's a great way to learn how to game with us, as well as get great gaming tips.
My gamer gal, Vex, hit me up on Facebook and had asked about the difference between running sci-fi versus a fantasy game and as the game master. And I believe she's talking about running a Star Wars game, and she's a little concerned and intimidated with putting together that type of adventure as opposed to running a fantasy adventure. Now, I can understand that from a standpoint of an old school fantasy adventure tends to be rather linear in design. You're creating a dungeon. There's a plot, whatever that dungeon might be. Now, there's two things here. One is if you're creating a linear type adventure, it can actually be done either way. It doesn't really matter. A dungeon can be anything, is kind of what I explained. But the other thing is, the thing that can be intimidating is if you're running a sandbox style game. If you're running that game in a fantasy world, it's so much smaller, right? Uh-huh. There's only so far the players can go.
You can only travel so fast.
Right, without excessive amounts of magic and high magic. Where in a science fiction game like Star Wars, where you have hyperdrives, your sandbox just got a whole lot bigger. So I can understand how it could be intimidating.
But in essence, a good game master, dungeon master, is aware not only of what plots and things that they have going on, but what the players have a design to do. And that could be through knowing what the party's goals are or what the players' goals are, or a combination of that and communication with the players. Hey guys, what do you want to do tomorrow? What do you want to do in the next session? By knowing what that is, you have the ability to prepare your material for whatever game.
Now, they might change it anyway.
Yeah. As my players are wont to do.
It's a little game we like to play amongst ourselves. Yeah, we don't tell Ted about it.
When the players and the DM's plans meet.
But anytime you're prepping material, you're going to prep your NPCs, you're going to prep your encounters, you're going to prep whatever accoutrements you might need.
Yeah, those are all similarities.
And it doesn't matter whether you're prepping it for a fantasy game or whether you're prepping it for a modern game or a sci-fi game.
One of the things to keep in mind, right? The adventure party is kind of the core basis for for running a fantasy game. Well, if you look at something like Firefly, or you look at Star Wars, or you look at the Away Team, they have the same dynamic as an adventuring party. Sure, it may look a little bit different. They might have different roles according to the setting, but at the same time, it still automatically creates this like adventuring party environment for you. So you just have to equate that from science fiction to fantasy, and find those analogies that you can use. As Ted was saying, by knowing what plots your players are looking to do or goals they're looking to achieve, by putting out those plot threads, you're going to have a greater likelihood of your characters not going off the rails and going in the direction you want them to go. One of the hardest thing about putting hooks out for players is when you put your own hooks out, you don't, it's a 50-50 whether they're going to bite or not. Mm-hmm. If you put out the hooks that they baited, they're almost guaranteed to bite every time.
When you're looking at session prep for sci-fi, you'd brought up Firefly or Star Trek's Away Team. I would look at, if you're specifically looking for Star Wars, I would look at Rebels. Look at, you've got this tight-knit group of people that have to work together as a team to work out these kind of missions. Now, I don't know what the scope of your campaign arc is or why this group is together, but that tying thread is your key. That's what you're going to want to need to make sure stays together so that you can have them keep revolving around that same central plot or thread.
Now, you guys haven't seen it yet, but I'm sure one of you, by the time this video goes live, will. Rogue One does the same thing. It creates that same dynamic that you can, that's the adventuring party. That makes it kind of easy.
All right, there's similarities that I find in both those games. I feel like Session Zero is really important, like you guys were mentioning. I feel like the characters' goals, you're gonna want characters to have something that you're gonna go along with, like Dave was saying, baiting the hooks that they throw out themselves. I think of this adventure. I think if you think of it as a sea campaign, like in a fantasy sea campaign, is very similar to being out on the ocean of space. So you have this idea. Players aren't just going to go willy-nilly anywhere. They're going to go where you kind of give them information on, because otherwise they're just kind of not charting a course. They're just going off into the ocean. And most people that do that are going to just die. So because you have resources, hyperdrive and other things like that, or faster than light travel, those all have resource use. So you don't want to just go off someplace, not really know where you're going. So it's sandboxy in a way, because they can kind of do anything, or you want to show them that they could do anything, but they're not just going to be like, yep, that second star to the right, let's do that. It was cool in Star Trek, so let's do it now. If you kind of give that kind of mentality of a seafaring campaign, you're not just going to go off into the wilderness.
So Nate, you brought up a good point, and that is the hidden character is the ship absolutely needs to be taken into account when you're doing a sci-fi game. And there's times that you need to muck with that. You need to have something happen, and tonight's adventure is all about the ship. They can't get on, they can't get off. That something broke, they need to get it fixed. These are great ways to use that central piece that, for everything else, has been unchanging, unwavering.
Damn, I'm trying to think of the Firefly episode.
I don't remember the name of.
But you know what episode?
Absolutely,
I'm sure everybody who's watching, you guys probably know. But yeah, and here's the other thing: like if you need help in expanding your horizons with running a science fiction game, but you're used to running fantasy, replace magic and mysticism with technology. Your dungeons are derelict ships, space stations, the Death Star, Jedi Temple, Sith Temple,
inside a giant purple worm thing.
Like all of these things could be the quote unquote dungeon,
or it could honestly be a dungeon.
Yes, if you need that kind of thing to help you as a game master spread your wings. In our Star Wars game, Scott Garibay had used what's her name, Maz
Kanata, yeah.
Maz Kanata's cantina as an actual dungeon, and that we had to go and explore,
right? Because we
retrieve artifacts from.
We had taken our campaign arc was immediately preceding Force Awakens. In the movie, the cantina was attacked, and therefore it was left in rubble. We had to go in and investigate.
It's the opposite of proceeding. The after-seeding.
Yeah.
Proceeding.
Yeah. Sorry. It happened immediately afterward.
Also, like, we went and looked for the cloning station, right? And that, like, even though we didn't actually enter it, that would have been a similar thing. See, I used to write out my adventures, and I would write out, very similar to a lot of the old school modules, and it's kind of like step, right? But later, as I started writing my adventures, I made them like flowcharts. Every choice that you make has possibilities. Now, your players may not even choose any of those. They might do something completely different. But if you just have in your mind kind of like these options, even if you don't have things statted out in mechanics, at least you have a direction that your mind is already moving in towards. That helps with improv. Mm-hmm. But if you have blank slate, it's going to be a lot tougher.
And I would say look at some normal like pop culture stuff. Like if you watch Firefly, or I'm thinking of Cowboy Bebop. Some of the adventures, some of those episodes happened on the ship. It's kind of like the ship is either as a combination of terrain / weather / random encounters that stuff can happen, and then like a derelict ship or something is the dungeon. So if you can pick out in like the episodes you watch of those different sci-fi shows, what's the dungeon, what's the hook, what's the weather or terrain difficulty, something that happens on the ship, stuff like that. Like a wagon wheel breaking, well, our warp drive doesn't work, something's happened, or right. We entered some weird spot in space, all that stuff. That's just the words used to describe the general tropes of what happens on an adventure.
Well, and also too, like any those iconic movies or media, the Enterprise, Millennium Falcon, Serenity, they all become this extra character, like Ted said, in the game. And it happened in our Star Wars game. We had the Star Kraken, and that Star Kraken game was really important to certain characters in the game. Where, oddly enough, other characters had ships, right? But they were just geared to them.
Right.
Where our ship was like, oh no, like we will lay down the law for this, and we will make many sacrifices to preserve this thing.
Right.
And I feel like that's what you kind of want in a Starfaring game anyway, because that's your way of getting around. It's your home. Like, it becomes so important.
And it's more than just a means. It's alive. It's home.
Look, you look at Star Trek. Look at all the episodes that are taking place just in the holodeck. Like that, that's a really cool thing. Or, if you look at other episodes where something happens with a ship, where the ship gets taken over, becomes sentient. Like, there's all these other things that can happen.
Going back to Force Awakens, what does Han say when he gets back to the Millennium Falcon?
Oh, it feels
We're
like
home.
we're home. Yeah.
We're home. Please. Rogue One has been released. It's been a year since Force Awakens.
If you haven't seen it, you're not a real fan. That's what Scott Garibay would say. What they were in a coma.
Well, then they shouldn't be watching YouTube. They should be watching Force Awakens.
Yeah, you should have woken up, got on some clothes, and went and started on it.
There is a plethora of ways that you can run your sci-fi game, and really, it doesn't really run any different than a fantasy game. It's just that your dressings are different. It looks different. And the fun thing about fantasy, too, depending on what kind of world you're playing in, I mean, not fantasy, about sci-fi, is you can actually have fantasy elements in it. And, I mean, you can do the same thing with fantasy, but it doesn't work nearly as well. Look at Star Wars. Star Wars really is less science fiction and more science fantasy anyway, because you have the Force, which is very much a mysticism, and you could literally replace magic with that.
It's D&D in space, pretty much, in a sense.
Yeah, and there's other tropes that are kind of similar, like Warhammer, 40K, and you could probably go on and on. But the question is, how do you guys run your science fiction games, and how do you differentiate between that and fantasy, or do you even? Let us know in the comments below. While you're at it, like, share, and subscribe.
Patronize us in a good way over on Patreon.
You can tweet at us at Nerdarchy.
So until next time,
stay nerdy.
Adventure as opposed to running a fantasy adventure. Now, I can understand that from a standpoint of an old school fantasy adventure tends to be rather linear in design. You're creating a dungeon. There's a plot. Whatever that.
Greetings, everyone. Nathan Nerdarchy here from Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds, and with me I have two nerds.
Nerdarchy's Ted.
Nerdarchy's Dave.
And today we ask, sci-fi RPGs, aren't they just D&D in space?
About the difference between running sci-fi versus a fantasy game and as the game master. And I believe she's talking about running a Star Wars game, and she's a little concerned and intimidated with putting together that type of dungeon might be. Now, there's two things here. One is, if you're creating a linear type adventure, it can actually be done either way. It doesn't really matter. A dungeon can be anything, is kind of what I explained. But the other...
Hey guys, jump down in the description below where you can sign up for Nerdarchy, the newsletter. It's a great way to learn how to game with us, as well as get great gaming tips.
My gamer gal, Vex, had hit me up on Facebook and had asked